On April 2nd, 1917, the air in Washington, D.C. was heavy. For 3 long years, President Woodrow Wilson had fought to keep America out of the Great War in Europe, holding tight to the nation's tradition of staying out of foreign conflicts. But reality was knocking. America's economy was tied to the Allies. The country was outraged by Germany's submarine attacks on civilian ships and a direct threat, the Zimmermann telegram, a secret German proposal to Mexico made staying neutral impossible. That night, Wilson stood before Congress. His voice, usually calm and academic, was filled with a new kind of fire. He asked for a declaration of war, but he framed it not as a fight for land or money, but as an ideological crusade. The world must be made safe for democracy, he declared. With those words, America officially entered World War I. This was the moment the United States shed its isolationist past and stepped onto the global stage. It wasn't just a military move, it was a mission to spread American ideals of justice and self-determination across the world. But there was a problem. The U.S. military was tiny, unprepared, and equipped for frontier skirmishes, not the brutal trench warfare of Europe. What America did have, however, was unmatched industrial power. The government immediately began the most sweeping expansion of federal power since the Civil War to transform the economy for war. New agencies popped up to manage everything. The War Industries Board, led by Bernard Baruch, took control of the economy. It decided what factories would produce, allocated raw materials, and even standardized products, like cutting down the number of bicycle pedal types from 100 to just 1. Free market competition basically stopped, with all industrial might focused on the war effort. Then there was the Food and Fuel Administration, headed by a brilliant engineer named Herbert Hoover. He launched patriotic campaigns with slogans like Wheatless Mondays and Meatless Tuesdays. This wasn't a law. It was a voluntary movement to encourage civilians to ration, which sent huge food surpluses to our starving allies. Hoover became a national hero. The government even temporarily nationalized the entire railroad system to ensure troops and supplies could move efficiently. The economic effect was immediate. The depression that had plagued the country since 1913 vanished under a flood of wartime contracts. Factories ran 24/7, unemployment disappeared, and the demand for labor soared. But Wilson knew that winning the war required more than just an army and factories. It required a unified public belief. America was a nation of immigrants, many with ties to both sides of the conflict. So, Wilson created the Committee on Public Information, or CPI, led by journalist George Creel. This committee became the most sophisticated propaganda machine the country had ever seen. Its mission was simple: build enthusiasm for the war and create hatred for the enemy, nicknamed the Huns. The CPI organized a network of 75,000 volunteer speakers called the 4-Minute Men. These speakers delivered short, patriotic speeches in movie theaters and public halls across the nation, bringing the government's message directly to millions. The CPI also produced millions of colorful posters, including the iconic image of Uncle Sam pointing at the viewer saying, "I want you." This wave of hyper-patriotism, however, had a dark side. It bred intolerance. Germans were portrayed as barbaric, leading to real persecution at home. German language classes were banned. German music was pulled from orchestras. And even foods got new names. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage. This patriotic fervor was also enforced by law. Wilson saw any dissent as a betrayal of the Great Crusade. Congress passed the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. These laws made it illegal to interfere with military recruitment or even to speak or write anything disloyal about the U.S. government. Over 1,500 people were arrested, including the famous socialist leader Eugene V, Debs, who was sentenced to 10 years in prison for giving an anti-war speech. The Supreme Court even upheld these laws, arguing that free speech could be limited if it posed a clear and present danger to the nation. The crusade for democracy abroad was being enforced by a crackdown on democracy at home. Meanwhile, the U.S. had to build its army. The Selective Service Act of 1917 created a draft, and by 1918, nearly 1 million men were in uniform. This was the American Expeditionary Force, or AEF, commanded by the formidable General John J. Blackjack Pershing. He insisted that his troops would fight as an independent American army, not just as replacements for the exhausted British and French forces. The arrival of these fresh, well-supplied American soldiers, known as doughboys, was a huge psychological blow to Germany. But the AEF was a segregated force. Around 400,000 African Americans served, hoping their sacrifice would finally earn them equal rights. Instead, they faced discrimination. Most were given non-combat roles like loading supplies. The black soldiers who did see combat were often assigned to the French army, where they fought with incredible bravery. The 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, spent more time in combat than any other American unit and were decorated by the French. Yet, when they returned home, they faced the same racism they had left behind. By the summer of 1918, American forces were making a decisive impact. They helped stop Germany's final, desperate offensive and played a key role in the massive Meuse-Argonne offensive, the brutal final campaign that broke the German army. On November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed. For America, the war had lasted just over a year and a half, but it cost 116,000 American lives. The soldiers celebrated, believing they had fulfilled Wilson's mission to make the world safe for democracy. But back home, the joy of victory quickly faded. The end of the war brought economic chaos. Millions of soldiers returned looking for jobs, just as factories shut down their wartime production lines. Unemployment soared, and with price controls gone, inflation skyrocketed, eating away at people's savings. This anxiety was supercharged by a new fear that swept the nation, the Red Scare. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia had created a communist state, and many Americans became terrified that a similar revolution was coming to their shores. This fear was fueled by a massive wave of labor strikes in 1919, with vermilion workers protesting low wages and high prices. When anarchist groups mailed bombs to prominent officials, the nation's paranoia exploded. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer launched a war on radicalism. In what became known as the Palmer Raids, federal agents arrested nearly 6,000 suspected radicals, often without warrants. Hundreds of foreign-born suspects were deported without a fair trial. At the same time, another internal war was raging. The wartime demand for labor had pulled over 500,000 African Americans from the rural South to northern cities in what is known as the Great Migration. They were looking for better jobs and an escape from Jim Crow oppression. But in the North, they found themselves competing with white workers for jobs and housing. The summer of 1919 exploded into violence and became known as the Red Summer. Horrific race riots broke out in over 36 cities. In Chicago, a riot lasted for 13 days, leaving 38 people dead. This violence revealed that America's racial divide ran deep, but it also sparked a new determination for self-defense and gave rise to the new Negro movement of the Harlem Renaissance. Amidst all this chaos, one great progressive dream was realized. After decades of struggle, the women's suffrage movement finally won the right to vote. Thanks to tireless lobbying and bold protests, pressure mounted on President Wilson, who finally endorsed the 19th Amendment. It was ratified in August 1920, doubling the American electorate and recognizing women as full political citizens. While America was fighting these battles at home, Wilson was in Paris trying to secure a lasting peace. His vision was the League of Nations, an international body designed to prevent future wars. But back in Washington, opposition was growing. Senators, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, feared the League would drag America into endless European conflicts. They wanted a return to isolationism. Wilson refused to compromise and, while on a desperate speaking tour to rally public support, he suffered a devastating stroke. The U.S. Senate rejected the treaty. America had won the war, but it refused to lead the peace. The election of 1920 sealed the deal. The nation, exhausted by war, idealism, and social turmoil, voted for a return to normalcy. America turned inward, leaving Wilson's dream of a new world order behind. The Great Crusade was over, but its consequences from a powerful centralized government to deep social fractures would shape the nation for decades to come. Tired of war, tired of crusades, tired of saving the world. That was America in 1920. After the chaos of the Red Scare, race riots, and a bitter fight over the League of Nations, the country was just done. They didn't want another grand, idealistic mission. They wanted to go home, make money, and enjoy life. So, they elected Warren G. Harding, a senator who promised exactly that, a return to normalcy. It was a landslide victory, a deafening rejection of the progressive era's fervor. America was turning inward, ready to cash in on its hard-won prosperity. The stage was set for a decade of wild contradictions, a time of booming consumerism, cultural rebellion, and financial recklessness. This was the dawn of the Roaring Twenties. The year is 1924, and the air is electric with change. The engine of this new era, the automobile. Henry Ford's assembly line didn't just build a car, it built a revolution. The Model T was suddenly affordable for the average family, and by the middle of the decade, there was one car for every 5 Americans. This wasn't just about getting from point A to point B, it was about freedom. Young people could escape the watchful eyes of their parents, shattering the old rules of courtship. The car created our modern landscape of paved highways, gas stations, diners, and motels. It gave birth to the family road trip. The auto industry became the backbone of the economy, driving demand for steel, rubber, and glass, and keeping the boom alive. But how could everyone afford this? A new idea took hold. Buying on credit. Buy now, pay later became the national mantra. The old virtue of saving money was out, spending and debt were in. This new foundation of prosperity was exciting, but it was also incredibly fragile. The soundtrack to this motorized, supercharged decade was jazz. Born in the African-American communities of New Orleans, Chicago, and New York's Harlem, jazz was everything the old world wasn't. It was improvisational, energetic, and it broke all the rules. It was the sound of spontaneity and rebellion. The rise of jazz fueled the Harlem Renaissance, a breathtaking explosion of black artistic and intellectual life. Writers like Langston Hughes and musicians like Duke Ellington weren't just creating art. They were celebrating black identity and challenging the roles assigned to them by a white society. For young white Americans, jazz was thrilling, a little dangerous, and the perfect music for the dance crazes sweeping the nation. And the symbol of this new, rebellious spirit, the flapper. With her short hair, shorter skirts, and a cigarette in hand, she was the icon of female liberation. A sign that the world was changing for women after they had finally won the right to vote. But as the cities roared, a powerful force was trying to silence them. This was the era of Prohibition. In 1919, the 18th Amendment outlawed alcohol, a move championed by rural, religious groups who saw it as a noble experiment to cure society's ills. The result was a complete disaster. Did people stop drinking? Of course not. They just did it in secret. Thousands of illegal bars called speakeasies sprang up in every city. These hidden clubs became hotspots where races and genders mixed with a freedom that was unheard of before, ironically creating the very culture the law was meant to stop. More importantly, Prohibition created a massive, fantastically profitable black market for illegal booze. This money bankrolled the rise of modern organized crime. Gangsters like Al Capone in Chicago built empires on liquor, gambling, and corruption, buying off police and politicians. Prohibition didn't make America more moral. It made it more cynical and turned criminals into millionaires. For the first time, America was becoming a truly national culture thanks to mass media. The radio was the internet of its day. Suddenly, a family in California could listen to the same jazz music, the same news report, and the same commercials as a family in New York. It created a shared national experience. Hollywood movies did the same, beaming images of the fast-paced, consumer-driven city life to every small town. The flapper, the car, the speakeasy, these weren't just local trends, they were national phenomena. But this new, modern, urban culture created a massive backlash. While the cities danced to jazz and questioned old traditions, rural America dug in its heels. This was the decade's central conflict, tradition versus modernity. A powerful movement of Christian fundamentalism rose up to defend the literal truth of the Bible against modern science. This clash exploded into a national spectacle with the Scopes monkey trial in 1925. where a teacher was put on trial for teaching evolution. It became a circus, pitting science against faith on a national stage. This fear of the modern world also fueled a terrifying resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. This new KKK wasn't just an anti-black group in the South, it was a national movement, with millions of members across the country who were against immigrants, Catholics, Jews, and a confident new Negro of the Harlem Renaissance. They were the violent expression of a desire to return to a white, Protestant, pure America. This sentiment led to the National Origins Act of 1924, a harsh new law that slammed the door on immigration. It established strict quotas, choking off the flow of people from Southern and Eastern Europe and Asia. The age of the melting pot was over, replaced by a policy of fear and exclusion. By 1928, it seemed like the party would never end. The business of America is business. President Calvin Coolidge famously said, "The stock market was soaring to unbelievable heights." But this wasn't based on the real value of companies, it was pure speculation, a national gambling fever. People were borrowing money to buy stocks, betting everything on the belief that the market could only go up. This confidence was blinding. The dominant philosophy was that the market could regulate itself. Government shouldn't interfere. Taxes on the rich were slashed with the promise that wealth would trickle down to everyone else. The nation was convinced it had discovered the secret to permanent prosperity. The engine of this delusion was a practice called buying on margin. A speculator could buy $10,000 worth of stock, with only $1,000 of their own money, borrowing the rest. If the stock went up just 10%, they doubled their money. It seemed like a foolproof way to get rich quick, and everyone from factory workers to housewives jumped in. But here was the trap. The whole system depended on prices constantly rising. If a stock dropped, the broker would demand the loan be repaid immediately, a margin call. If you couldn't pay, your stock was sold instantly, pushing prices down even further and creating a domino effect of panic. Beneath the shimmering surface of the Roaring Twenties, the foundations were cracking. All the wealth from the boom was concentrating at the very top, while most workers' wages barely budged. Farmers had been in a depression for years. Banks were making reckless, unregulated loans, and the whole system was built on the shaky sands of credit and speculation. The joyous, jazz-fueled, reckless decade was a beautiful illusion. As the 1920s drew to a close, America was dancing on the edge of a cliff, completely unaware of the economic abyss that was about to open up beneath it. Think back to the Roaring Twenties. On the surface, America was glittering. Jazz clubs were packed, the stock market was soaring, and it seemed like everyone was getting rich. But beneath that shiny veneer, the economy was a house of cards built on three hidden fatal flaws. First, let's talk about the money. Where did all this cash for speculating on stocks come from? Much of it was borrowed from regular commercial banks. This meant the stability of the entire US banking system was tied to the incredibly risky, unpredictable stock market. The Federal Reserve, the institution that should have stepped in, did nothing. They just let the speculative lending run wild, convinced the good times would last forever. But the real problems ran even deeper. The first was staggering income inequality. Henry Ford's assembly line was churning out cars and radios at an incredible rate. But who could actually afford to buy them in the 1920s? The top 5% of the population earned over a third of all personal income, while the rich poured their extra cash into the stock market, fueling the bubble. Most workers saw their wages barely budge. This created a huge demand problem. The only way the average family could afford a new car or appliance was by going into debt, using installment plans. Production was skyrocketing, but people's ability to actually pay for these goods was not. It was a ticking time bomb. Once people hit their credit limits, sales would stop and factories would grind to a halt. Second, while the cities were celebrating, America's farmers were already living through a decade-long depression. During World War I, they had borrowed heavily to plant more crops and feed Europe. But after the war, European farms recovered and the demand for American food plummeted. Prices crashed, but the farmers' debts didn't disappear. All across rural America, farms were being foreclosed on, which in turn caused rural banks to fail. This sent a constant stream of instability into the financial system. completely separate from the Wall Street boom. The third floor was the international economy. It was a fragile, tangled mess of war debts. Britain and France owed the US billions from World War I. They planned to repay America using the reparations they were collecting from Germany. But here's the catch. America had extremely high tariffs, making it nearly impossible for European countries to sell their goods in the US and earn the money they needed. So, how did they pay? They borrowed even more money, this time from private American investors. It was a crazy loop. American money went to Germany, Germany paid reparations to Britain and France, and they used that money to pay their war debts back to the US Treasury. It was a global Ponzi scheme, hiding the fact that America was selling far more than it was buying. If American private lending ever stopped, the whole international system would instantly collapse. Throughout 1928 and 1929, the market just kept climbing. The widespread belief in endless prosperity silenced anyone who dared to be cautious. The so-called experts, bankers, politicians, and economists all sang the same tune. President Herbert Hoover declared, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before." Even when the market showed small signs of trouble in the fall of 1929, prominent bankers held press conferences calling it a healthy correction and saying anyone who sold was a fool. It was a collective delusion. The trap was set. All it needed was a tiny trigger. In the autumn of 1929, foreign investors, worried about the high interest rates on margin loans, quietly started pulling their money out of the American market. That was the first domino. On Thursday, October 24, 1929, panic selling hit the New York Stock Exchange. No one was buying, everyone was selling, and prices nosedived. A group of powerful bankers, led by J.P. Morgan Jr., tried to stop the bleeding by publicly buying stocks at high prices, just like Morgan's father had done in a previous crisis. It worked, but only for a weekend. Then came Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929. The market didn't just slide, it completely collapsed. A record 16 million shares were traded. The market lost over $14 billion in a single day. Within a month, the total value lost was more than the entire cost of fighting World War I. The effect was instantaneous and brutal. The falling prices triggered a wave of margin calls. Speculators who couldn't repay their loans had their stocks sold by their brokers, driving prices even lower. People who thought they were rich were bankrupt in an instant. The banks that had loaned out all that money were next. As news of the crash spread, terrified depositors rushed to withdraw their savings. But the banks didn't have the cash. There was no federal deposit insurance back then. If your bank failed, your life savings vanished. Thousands of banks went under. The psychological shock was immense. The belief in endless prosperity was replaced by a deep, paralyzing fear that everything had fallen apart. The golden trap had snapped shut. But the crash was just the beginning. The ripple effect spread from Wall Street to every main street in America. With investment gone and banks failing, businesses had no choice but to cut production and lay off workers. By 1933, 1 out of every 4 American workers was jobless. Poverty became the new reality for millions. Cities were filled with the heartbreaking sight of soup and bread lines where once proud men waited for hours for a simple meal. As people lost their homes, shantytowns sprang up in parks and on the outskirts of cities. They were made of scrap wood, tin, and cardboard, and people bitterly nicknamed them Hoovervilles, a jab at the president many blamed for the disaster. A lost generation of men and boys began riding the rails, illegally hopping freight trains to wander the country in a desperate search for any work at all. And as if the economic collapse wasn't enough, an ecological catastrophe was unfolding in the heartland, the Dust Bowl. For decades, farmers had used aggressive plowing techniques that stripped the land of the native prairie grasses that held the soil in place. When a severe drought hit the southern plains in 1930, the exposed topsoil just dried up and blew away. This created the infamous black blizzards, massive, towering dust storms that swept across the plains, burying farms and homes. The air was thick with dust, causing a sickness called dust pneumonia. Millions of acres of farmland were destroyed. This forced a mass migration. Hundreds of thousands of desperate farm families, often called Okies, abandoned their ruined land and headed west to California, chasing a broken promise of a better life. The stock market crash wasn't just a financial event. It exposed the deep flaws in American society and unleashed a decade of hardship that would reshape the nation forever. Imagine this, it's the early 1930s. You pile everything you own into a beat-up, overloaded car. Your family is squeezed in beside you, clinging to one last shred of hope. You're heading west on Route 66, chasing a dream of sunshine and steady work in the fertile valleys of California. This was the journey for thousands of Dust Bowl migrants, a desperate pilgrimage toward a promised land. But California was no paradise. Instead of salvation, they found a state already buckling under the weight of the Depression. The job market was saturated. Locals, fearful and hostile, saw these newcomers not as fellow Americans in need, but as a threat. The dream of picking fruit for a decent wage evaporated into a harsh reality of earning maybe 15 cents an hour. They were forced into squalid migrant camps, where exploitation and prejudice were the daily currency. The dream of a new start was shattered. This dual catastrophe, an economic collapse on Wall Street and an ecological disaster on the Great Plains, was a brutal lesson. The reckless gambling in the financial markets was mirrored by the reckless exploitation of the land. Both systems, built on the promise of short-term gain with no thought for the future, had collapsed in spectacular fashion, plunging the nation into a shared trauma of poverty and despair. At the helm of this sinking ship was President Herbert Hoover, a man who had been hailed as a hero for his relief efforts in World War I. Hoover was now ideologically paralyzed. He was a firm believer in rugged individualism, the idea that people succeed through their own efforts and that government help was an attack on American liberty. His response to the crisis was, to put it mildly, disastrous. At first, he simply denied the severity of the problem, famously insisting that prosperity is just around the corner. He believed the market would correct itself. When that didn't happen, he resisted calls for direct federal aid, arguing that charity and local governments should handle it. But the sheer scale of the need overwhelmed these private resources completely. By the time he did act, it was too little, too late. He created programs like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which gave massive loans to banks and railroads. This was a form of trickle-down economics meant to stabilize the top of the pyramid. But for the millions at the bottom living in shanty towns they bitterly nicknamed Hoovervilles, standing in soup kitchen lines and desperately riding the rails in search of work, not a single drop trickled down to them. Hoover's philosophy sounded cruel and detached. A feeling began to grow that the government simply did not care. By 1931, the Great Depression was no longer about stock prices, it was a battle for survival. The initial shock had morphed into a grinding, soul-crushing despair. Over 13 million Americans were jobless. In industrial hubs like Detroit, unemployment shot past 50%. Work, the very bedrock of American identity, had vanished. The psychological toll was immense. Men who were once proud providers felt a deep, gnawing shame. Families fractured under the strain. The desperation was etched into the details of everyday life. People learned to stretch every penny. They repaired worn-out shoes with cardboard. They patched and repatched clothing until it was more patched than fabric. Meals shrank to thin soups and potatoes. On street corners, a new, heartbreaking sight appeared. Laid-off professional men, still in their worn-out suits, selling apples for 5 cents apiece. It was a tragic symbol of the sudden, brutal fall from middle-class security. And yet, asking for help was seen as a personal failure. People called charity or government aid the dole, and the shame associated with it was profound. The nation's social safety net, which was never strong to begin with, had completely disintegrated. City and state relief funds ran dry almost immediately. The burden fell on churches and unions running soup kitchens, but they were just a finger in a dam that had already burst. Then came the bank runs. As thousands of banks failed, the life savings of entire communities vanished overnight. By 1933, over 9,000 banks had collapsed, taking the trust and the security of the American people with them. The railroads became the highways for the jobless. Hundreds of thousands of men, and even some women and children, became hobos, illegally riding freight trains across the country, chasing rumors of work that rarely materialized. They carried the despair of the cities into every corner of the nation. Throughout all this, President Hoover seemed trapped by his own ideology. He was a compassionate man personally, but his rigid belief in limited government made him incapable of taking the bold action the country desperately needed. He saw direct federal relief as a moral poison that would destroy the American character. His main strategy was to plead with business leaders to maintain wages promises. They couldn't possibly keep on to try and talk the nation back into confidence. By repeating that the economy was fundamentally sound, the public saw a bitter irony. The government was willing to spend millions to bail out big banks through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, but it offered nothing to the starving individual. The name Hooverville wasn't just a nickname, it was an indictment. The president became a symbol of heartless indifference, a man who seemed to care more about abstract economic principles than about his suffering people. The breaking point, the moment that sealed Hoover's political fate, came in the summer of 1932. It was the crisis of the bonus army. World War I veterans had been promised a bonus for their service, payable in 1945. Now destitute, thousands of these veterans marched on Washington, D.C., demanding an early payment. They weren't asking for a handout, they were asking for money they had earned. They set up a massive, peaceful camp near the Capitol. Nearly 20,000 men, women, and children who had sacrificed for their country were now living in shacks, demanding that their government honor its promise. But the Senate rejected their bill. As most veterans prepared to go home, Hoover made a catastrophic decision. Fearing radical elements, he ordered the U.S. Army to clear the remaining campers. The operation was led by General Douglas MacArthur, with future legends Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton as his aides. MacArthur went far beyond Hoover's orders. He deployed cavalry, tanks, and tear gas against the unarmed veterans and their families. They routed the men who had fought for America and then burned their shacks to the ground. The image was seared into the national consciousness: American soldiers using military force against their own impoverished, unarmed veterans. It was a horrifying spectacle that seemed to prove the government had lost its way. It was the final, bloody verdict on the ideology of laissez-faire economics. Hoover was forever branded as a cold leader who would rather balance a budget than feed his people. The nation's despair was no longer just about lost money. It was about a lost faith in the American system itself. The old rules had failed. The old leadership had failed. A vacuum had been created, setting the stage for a radical change, and a political revolution that would reshape the relationship between the government and its citizens forever. The year is 1932. America is on its knees. The Roaring Twenties feel like a distant, cruel joke. For 3 long years, the Great Depression has tightened its grip, squeezing the life out of the nation. The intellectual debates of the past about how much a government should do for its people are no longer academic. They are screamed in the streets by millions of jobless, hungry Americans. The old way is broken. The philosophy of rugged individualism and a hands-off government has led to disaster. The people don't just want charity, they demand action. They demand that the federal government step in and acknowledge that the system has failed them. This climate of hopelessness was the perfect stage for a new kind of leader. Someone willing to tear up the old rulebook and write a new contract between the government and its citizens. That leader was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He didn't promise a return to normal. He promised a new deal for the forgotten man. The election of 1932 wasn't just about 2 men. It was a referendum on America's future. The people, tired of President Hoover's reassurances while they were being evicted from their homes, voted overwhelmingly for a promise of radical change. FDR, a wealthy New Yorker who had battled polio and radiated an infectious optimism, swept into office with a clear mandate: act and act now. But the 4 months between his election and his inauguration were a dark, agonizing winter. The economy ground to a halt. Businesses failed. A final, terrifying wave of bank runs swept the nation, draining what little cash was left. By the morning of March 4, 1933, when Roosevelt took the oath of office, Capitalism itself seemed to be collapsing. The country was paralyzed by fear, waiting for a leader to tell them what to do, to tell them that America was not finished. Facing this national despair, Roosevelt's first act was one of brilliant psychological leadership. In his inaugural address, he looked the crisis square in the eye. He spoke words that would echo through history. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror. He then promised to wage war on the economic emergency, demanding broad executive power, just as if the country had been invaded by a foreign foe. The era of laissez-faire was over. A new era of government activism was dawning. Roosevelt's first move was his boldest. He tackled the single greatest source of panic, the collapsing banks. Just 2 days after his inauguration, he declared a national bank holiday, closing every bank in the country for 4 days. This single, decisive action stopped the bleeding. It gave the nation a moment to breathe and created an atmosphere of control. While the banks were closed, Congress, energized by FDR's leadership, passed the Emergency Banking Act in just 8 hours. This law gave the Treasury Department the power to inspect all banks, reopen the healthy ones, and reorganize the ones that were failing. Then, on March 12th, Roosevelt did something truly revolutionary. He spoke directly to the American people through the radio in his first fireside chat. In a calm, reassuring voice, he explained what the government was doing. He made the complex banking legislation simple, telling people it was now safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than under the mattress. The effect was electric. When the banks reopened, people lined up not to withdraw their money, but to deposit it. Cash flowed back into the system. The immediate threat of a total financial meltdown was over. It was a stunning victory, proving that decisive federal action could restore faith in the system. What followed was an avalanche of legislation unlike anything America had ever seen. The period from March to June of 1933 became known as the 100 Days. Working with a Democratic-controlled Congress, FDR passed 15 major bills that fundamentally reshaped the relationship between the government, business, and the American people. The strategy was simple: relief, recovery, and reform. To restore trust in the financial system, Congress created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC. This insured individual bank deposits up to $5,000. With that one move, the government ended the plague of bank runs forever. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, was created to police the stock market, ending the wild speculation that had caused the 1929 crash. Wall Street was finally under federal regulation. For the millions of unemployed, the government created direct relief programs. The Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, put nearly 3 million young men to work in national parks and forests. They planted trees, fought fires, and built roads, sending most of their wages home to their desperate families. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration gave direct cash grants to states to help the jobless, marking the first time the federal government provided direct aid to the needy, a complete reversal of Hoover's policies. The crisis on the farms was tackled with the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or AAA. It paid farmers to reduce production in order to raise crop prices. While controversial for destroying food when people were starving, it brought desperately needed cash into the farm sector, saving countless families from foreclosure. Perhaps the most ambitious project was the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA. This agency built a series of massive dams along the Tennessee River, bringing flood control, cheap electricity, and modern infrastructure to one of the poorest regions in the country. The TVA showed the government acting not just as a regulator, but as a direct driver of economic development. By the end of 1933, the panic had subsided. The country wasn't fixed, but hope had been restored. The nation had shifted from passive despair to active experimentation. A triumphant dawn had arrived, but the fight was far from over. By 1934, the initial rush of the 100 days had faded. The economy was still stuck in low gear, and millions were still unemployed. FDR was feeling pressure from all sides. From the right, corporate interests and a conservative Supreme Court fought his every move. And from the left, populist leaders like Senator Huey Long were demanding even more radical action, calling to share our wealth. Roosevelt knew he had to do more. So, In 1935, he pivoted, launching what became known as the Second New Deal. The focus shifted from temporary relief to permanent, fundamental reform. He was building a new foundation for American society. The centerpiece was the Social Security Act of 1935. This was the most revolutionary piece of legislation of the era. For the first time, the federal government took permanent responsibility for the economic security of its citizens. It created a national pension system for retired workers, funded by a payroll tax. It established unemployment insurance to help those who lost their jobs. And it provided aid to the disabled and poor families with children. Social Security wasn't charity, it was an earned right, a promise that in America, old age and bad luck would no longer mean guaranteed poverty. The Second New Deal also transformed the balance of power between workers and bosses. The Wagner Act was like a Magna Carta for labor. It federally protected the right of workers to organize unions, to bargain collectively, and to strike. It created the National Labor Relations Board to ensure companies treated their workers fairly. The days of corporations crushing unions with impunity were over. This act unleashed a massive surge in union membership, giving working people a powerful voice in the nation's economy and politics. To tackle the stubborn problem of unemployment, Roosevelt created the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. It was the largest relief program in American history, employing over 8 million people. They built hundreds of thousands of miles of roads, public buildings, bridges, and airports. But the WPA was unique because it also created jobs for artists, writers, musicians, and actors. These federal arts projects preserved American culture and gave a voice to the common person, celebrating their stories and struggles. The WPA gave people more than a paycheck. It gave them dignity and purpose. Finally, to fund these programs and address the massive inequality that caused the Depression, Roosevelt championed the wealth tax of 1935. It raised taxes on large incomes, corporate profits, and inheritances. Politically, it was a powerful statement that the government would use its power to ensure a fairer distribution of wealth. By 1936, the New Deal had forged a new social contract. The government was now a broker mediating between business, labor, and agriculture. The financial system was stable. Workers had protected rights, and citizens had a safety net against disaster. Roosevelt hadn't ended the Depression yet, but he had done something just as important. He had saved American democracy and capitalism by reforming them from within, giving a new sense of security and hope to a generation that had lost both voices right here at home. The New Deal was radical. It regulated Wall Street, protected unions, and created a federal safety net. For wealthy conservatives and corporate titans, this was pure socialism. They saw FDR as a tyrant, shredding the Constitution to expand his own power. But from the other side, from the left, populist firebrands shouted that FDR hadn't gone far enough. They accused him of saving capitalism, not remaking it for the common person. The loudest of these voices was Senator Huey P. Long of Louisiana, a magnetic and powerful demagogue known as the Kingfish. Through the radio and massive rallies, Long electrified the public with his Share Our Wealth program. His plan was simple and seductive. Confiscate all personal fortunes over $5 million and guarantee every American family a home and an annual income of at least $2,000. Long's movement was a real threat to FDR's re-election, channeling the deep-seated anger many felt towards the financial elite. Then there was Father Charles Coughlin, the radio priest. Broadcasting from his Detroit church, he commanded a weekly audience of up to 45 million people. Initially a New Deal supporter, he turned sharply against FDR, demanding the nationalization of banks and blaming the Depression on international bankers. With his rhetoric growing darker and more divisive over time, he organized the National Union for Social Justice, giving a platform to millions who felt the New Deal had betrayed them. And we can't forget Dr. Francis Townsend. He mobilized millions of elderly Americans with a simple, though economically questionable, idea: a federal pension of $200 a month for everyone over 60, as long as they spent it all within 30 days. Though the plan itself was unworkable, it showed the massive political demand for old age security. FDR was a master strategist. He countered these threats by co-opting their most popular ideas. The Social Security Act was a direct answer to Townsend's call for pensions, and a new wealth tax aimed to neutralize Huey Long's base by targeting high incomes. FDR skillfully steered the Second New Deal further to the left, absorbing his rivals' energy. While the populists demanded more, the conservative business elite demanded less. Wealthy families like the DuPonts, along with leaders from General Motors, formed the American Liberty League in 1934. They spent millions on ads comparing FDR's programs to Bolshevism and fascism. They argued the New Deal was an un-American assault on property rights and free enterprise. But their most dangerous weapon wasn't propaganda, it was the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in the mid-1930s was dominated by conservative justices, who FDR famously called the Nine Old Men. They believed the New Deal's expansion of federal power was unconstitutional, and from 1935 to 1936, they began to systematically dismantle it. First, in a case called Schechter Poultry Corp. versus the U.S., the court struck down the National Industrial Recovery Act, the centerpiece of the first New Deal. The court ruled that the federal government had no authority to regulate wages and hours within a state. FDR was furious, saying the court had thrown the nation back to a horse and buggy definition of commerce. Then, just a year later, the court invalidated the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which was the cornerstone of farm recovery. The New Deal was on the ropes. The court had essentially declared that the problems of the Great Depression were beyond the constitutional reach of the federal government. But FDR had just won a massive landslide re-election in 1936, and he saw it as a mandate from the American people. In February 1937, he dropped a political bombshell, the Judicial Procedures Reform Bill, better known as the Court Packing Plan. His proposal was clever. For every Supreme Court justice over the age of 70 who refused to retire, the president could appoint a new one, up to a total of 6. The goal was obvious: to pack the court with justices who would support the New Deal. FDR tried to sell it as a way to help the overworked aging justices, but everyone saw through it. The plan ignited a firestorm. Critics, including many of FDR's own allies, accused him of becoming a dictator and trying to destroy the independence of the judiciary. It was a massive political gamble that backfired, and the bill ultimately failed in the Senate. But even in failure, FDR won the war. The political threat of the court packing plan was enough. In what became known as the switch in time that saved 9, one of the conservative justices, Owen Roberts, suddenly began voting to uphold New Deal legislation. The court, sensing the public mood and fearing a constitutional crisis, retreated. They upheld the Wagner Act, which protected unions, and they upheld the Social Security Act. This judicial shift was monumental. It cemented the federal government's power to regulate the national economy, a power it still holds today. By 1937, the storm of dissent had begun to pass. Huey Long had been assassinated, and Father Coughlin's influence was fading. FDR had faced down his critics from both the left and the right, and the foundations of the modern American welfare state were secure. But as these domestic battles subsided, America began to look outward and saw a world rapidly descending into chaos. The national mood was fiercely isolationist. Americans, scarred by World War I and buried in the Great Depression, wanted nothing to do with foreign squabbles. The belief was widespread that bankers and foreign propagandists, the merchants of death, had tricked the U.S. into the last war. Congress reflected this mood by passing a series of neutrality acts. These laws were designed to legislate America out of the next war. They banned the sale of arms and the lending of money to any nation at war. A later provision, called cash and carry, allowed sales of non-military goods, but only if the buyer paid in cash and transported the goods on their own ships. America was trying to build a legal fortress to keep war out. But while America looked inward, totalitarian regimes were on the rise. In Italy, Mussolini's fascists invaded Ethiopia, and the League of Nations did nothing. In Germany, Adolf Hitler was rearming the nation in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. His Nazi ideology built on racial hatred and territorial conquest. The Spanish Civil War became a horrifying dress rehearsal for World War II, with Germany and Italy testing their new weapons on Spanish cities like Guernica, while the Western democracies, including the U.S., stood by, paralyzed by their own laws. The stage was set. Roosevelt had weathered the political storms at home, fundamentally reshaping the role of government in American life. But a far greater storm was gathering across the oceans. The fight to save American democracy at home was over. The fight for democracy abroad was about to. The year is 1932. America is on its knees. The Roaring Twenties feel like a distant, cruel joke. For 3 long years, the Great Depression has tightened its grip, squeezing the life out of the nation. The intellectual debates of the past about how much a government should do for its people are no longer academic. They are screamed in the streets by millions of jobless, hungry Americans. The old way is broken. The philosophy of rugged individualism and a hands-off government has led to disaster. The people don't just want charity, they demand action. They demand that the federal government step in and acknowledge that the system has failed them. This climate of hopelessness was the perfect stage for a new kind of leader. Someone willing to tear up the old rulebook and write a new contract between the government and its citizens. That leader was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He didn't promise a return to normal. He promised a new deal for the forgotten man. The election of 1932 wasn't just about 2 men. It was a referendum on America's future. The people, tired of President Hoover's reassurances while they were being evicted from their homes, voted overwhelmingly for a promise of radical change. FDR, a wealthy New Yorker who had battled polio and radiated an infectious optimism, swept into office with a clear mandate: act and act now. But the 4 months between his election and his inauguration were a dark, agonizing winter. The economy ground to a halt. Businesses failed. A final, terrifying wave of bank runs swept the nation, draining what little cash was left. By the morning of March 4, 1933, when Roosevelt took the oath of office, capitalism itself seemed to be collapsing. The country was paralyzed by fear, waiting for a leader to tell them what to do, to tell them that America was not finished. Facing this national despair, Roosevelt's first act was one of brilliant psychological leadership. In his inaugural address, he looked the crisis square in the eye. He spoke words that would echo through history. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror. He then promised to wage war on the economic emergency, demanding broad executive power, just as if the country had been invaded by a foreign foe. The era of laissez-faire was over. A new era of government activism was dawning. Roosevelt's first move was his boldest. He tackled the single greatest source of panic, the collapsing banks. Just 2 days after his inauguration, he declared a national bank holiday, closing every bank in the country for 4 days. This single, decisive action stopped the bleeding. It gave the nation a moment to breathe and created an atmosphere of control. While the banks were closed, Congress, energized by FDR's leadership, passed the Emergency Banking Act in just 8 hours. This law gave the Treasury Department the power to inspect all banks, reopen the healthy ones, and reorganize the ones that were failing. Then, on March 12th, Roosevelt did something truly revolutionary. He spoke directly to the American people through the radio in his first fireside chat. In a calm, reassuring voice, he explained what the government was doing. He made the complex banking legislation simple, telling people it was now safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than under the mattress. The effect was electric. When the banks reopened, people lined up not to withdraw their money, but to deposit it. Cash flowed back into the system. The immediate threat of a total financial meltdown was over. It was a stunning victory, proving that decisive federal action could restore faith in the system. What followed was an avalanche of legislation unlike anything America had ever seen. The period from March to June of 1933 became known as the 100 Days. Working with a Democratic-controlled Congress, FDR passed 15 major bills that fundamentally reshaped the relationship between the government, business, and the American people. The strategy was simple: relief, recovery, and reform. To restore trust in the financial system, Congress created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC. This ensured individual bank deposits up to $5,000. With that one move, the government ended the plague of bank runs forever. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, was created to police the stock market, ending the wild speculation that had caused the 1929 crash. Wall Street was finally under federal regulation. For the millions of unemployed, the government created direct relief programs. The Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, put nearly 3 million young men to work in national parks and forests. They planted trees, fought fires, and built roads, sending most of their wages home to their desperate families. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration gave direct cash grants to states to help the jobless, marking the first time the federal government provided direct aid to the needy, a complete reversal of Hoover's policies. The crisis on the farms was tackled with the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or AAA. It paid farmers to reduce production in order to raise crop prices. While controversial for destroying food when people were starving, it brought desperately needed cash into the farm sector, saving countless families from foreclosure. Perhaps the most ambitious project was the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA. This agency built a series of massive dams along the Tennessee River, bringing flood control, cheap electricity, and modern infrastructure to one of the poorest regions in the country. The TVA showed the government acting not just as a regulator, but as a direct driver of economic development. By the end of 1933, the panic had subsided. The country wasn't fixed, but hope had been restored. The nation had shifted from passive despair to active experimentation. A triumphant dawn had arrived, but the fight was far from over. By 1934, the initial rush of the 100 days had faded. The economy was still stuck in low gear, and millions were still unemployed. FDR was feeling pressure from all sides. From the right, corporate interests and a conservative Supreme Court fought his every move. And from the left, populist leaders like Senator Huey Long were demanding even more radical action, calling to share our wealth. Roosevelt knew he had to do more. So, in 1935, he pivoted, launching what became known as the Second New Deal. The focus shifted from temporary relief to permanent, fundamental reform. He was building a new foundation for American society. The centerpiece was the Social Security Act of 1935. This was the most revolutionary piece of legislation of the era. For the first time, the federal government took permanent responsibility for the economic security of its citizens. It created a national pension system for retired workers, funded by a payroll tax. It established unemployment insurance to help those who lost their jobs. And it provided aid to the disabled and poor families with children. Social Security wasn't charity. It was an earned right, a promise that in America, old age and bad luck would no longer mean guaranteed poverty. The Second New Deal also transformed the balance of power between workers and bosses. The Wagner Act was like a Magna Carta for labor. It federally protected the right of workers to organize unions, to bargain collectively, and to strike. It created the National Labor Relations Board to ensure companies treated their workers fairly. The days of corporations crushing unions with impunity were over. This act unleashed a massive surge in union membership, giving working people a powerful voice in the nation's economy and politics. To tackle the stubborn problem of unemployment, Roosevelt created the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. It was the largest relief program in American history, employing over 8 million people. They built hundreds of thousands of miles of roads, public buildings, bridges, and airports. But the WPA was unique because it also created jobs for artists, writers, musicians, and actors. These federal arts projects preserved American culture and gave a voice to the common person, celebrating their stories and struggles. The WPA gave people more than a paycheck. It gave them dignity and purpose. Finally, to fund these programs and address the massive inequality that caused the Depression, Roosevelt championed the wealth tax of 1935. It raised taxes on large incomes, corporate profits, and inheritances. Politically, it was a powerful statement that the government would use its power to ensure a fairer distribution of wealth. By 1936, the New Deal had forged a new social contract. The government was now a broker mediating between business, labor, and agriculture. The financial system was stable, workers had protected rights, and citizens had a safety net against disaster. Roosevelt hadn't ended the Depression yet, but he had done something just as important. He had saved American democracy and capitalism by reforming them from within, giving a new sense of security and hope to a generation that had lost both. August 9, 1945, 3 days after Hiroshima, the world held its breath. Japan had not surrendered. A second American B-29 bomber, carrying a plutonium bomb nicknamed Fat Man, flew towards the city of Nagasaki. The resulting explosion vaporized the city center and claimed another 40,000 lives. The shock of these twin attacks was overwhelming. Combined with the Soviet Union's sudden declaration of war and invasion of Manchuria, the Japanese government was left with no choice. On August 15th, they announced their unconditional surrender. VJ Day. The world erupted in celebration. The most destructive war in human history was finally over. The United States emerged from the chaos not just victorious, but fundamentally transformed. The era of the Great Depression and global conflict had forged a new nation one, armed with unparalleled power and burdened with immense global responsibility. Think back to the end of World War I. America had retreated into isolation, wanting nothing more than a return to normalcy. But after World War II, there was no retreat. The US was the only major power whose factories weren't in ruins. In fact, its industrial might had exploded. It commanded the most powerful navy and air force on the planet, and, most critically, it held a monopoly on the atomic bomb. This was the dawn of the Pax Americana New World Order guaranteed by American military and economic power. But this new era began with a profound shock at home. In April 1945, just weeks before victory in Europe, President Franklin D. Roosevelt died. The man who had guided the nation through its darkest economic crisis and a world war was gone. The immense task of winning the peace fell to his vice president, a plain-spoken former senator from Missouri named Harry S. Truman was an unlikely leader for this moment. He lacked Roosevelt's international polish and was largely kept in the dark about the biggest secrets of the war, including the Manhattan Project. He was sworn in and suddenly found himself responsible for the atomic bomb, negotiations with Stalin, and the fate of the post-war world. He was the common man, thrust into the most powerful office on earth at the most perilous time. Yet, his direct, no-nonsense approach was perhaps exactly what the world needed to confront the brutal realities that lay ahead. One of the first and most important tasks was to build a new foundation for global peace. America had rejected the League of Nations after the last war, a decision many felt had paved the way for this one. They would not make the same mistake twice. In April 1945, even before the war ended, delegates from 50 nations gathered in San Francisco. Their mission, to create the United Nations. The US was a driving force, and this time, Congress overwhelmingly approved. It was a complete rejection of the isolationism of the past. The UN was designed to settle disputes peacefully. At its heart was the Security Council, giving veto power to the 5 main victors: the US, Great Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union. The idea was simple: global peace depended on the great powers working together. Alongside the UN, the US helped create the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to stabilize the global economy. This ensured that American-style capitalism would be the engine of reconstruction. But even as these institutions were being built, a deep crack was forming in the foundation of the post-war world. During the war, the alliance between the democratic United States and the communist Soviet Union was one of pure necessity. They had a common enemy in Hitler, but with that enemy gone, their vast ideological differences became impossible to ignore. The Cold War had begun. The Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, wasted no time. He used his Red Army, which had liberated Eastern Europe from the Nazis, to install loyal communist governments in Poland, Romania, Hungary, and elsewhere. He was creating a buffer zone, a bloc of satellite states loyal to Moscow. In 1946, Winston Churchill gave a speech in Fulton, Missouri, where he gave this new reality a name. He warned that an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent, dividing the free West from the Soviet-controlled East. The term stuck. It perfectly defined the new ideological struggle that would dominate the next 50 years. The final, and perhaps most crucial, pillar of this new Pax Americana was its incredible economic power. In 1945, the United States produced nearly half of the world's manufactured goods. It held 2/3 of the world's gold. The arsenal of democracy that had armed the Allies was now ready to become the engine of global recovery. But what about at home, with millions of soldiers returning? Many feared a return to the crushing unemployment of the Great Depression. Congress acted decisively with one of the most transformative laws in American history, the GI Bill. This revolutionary act gave returning veterans money for college or vocational training, unemployment benefits, and low-interest loans to buy homes. This wasn't just a thank you, it was a massive investment in the American people. Millions of working-class men who never would have had the chance went to college. They bought homes, started families, and fueled the rise of the American suburbs. The GI Bill created a stable, educated, property-owning middle class that would power the country's post-war economic boom for decades. It was the ultimate fulfillment of the New Deal promise of security and opportunity. So, by the end of 1945, the transformation was complete. The period that began with World War I was shattered by the Depression and was redefined by World War II had forged a new American identity. Isolationism was dead, replaced by a commitment to lead the free world. The federal government, once small, was now a permanent, powerful force in American life, guaranteeing a basic social safety net and managing the economy. The war had also cracked open doors for women and African Americans, who had contributed so much to the victory. They had fought for democracy abroad and now demanded it at home, setting the stage for the civil rights struggles to come. The year 1945 wasn't just the end of a war, it was the end of an entire chapter of American history. The nation had been stripped of its innocence, hardened by crisis, and elevated to the absolute summit of global power. The old challenges of industrial titans and urban poverty had been replaced by a new, terrifying one, containing communism under the shadow of the atomic bomb. The United States, forged in the fires of global crisis, was now ready to lead the world into the Cold War. Thanks for watching. If you found this journey through history insightful, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the moments that shaped our world. We'll see you in the next one.